The muted hum of the office fluorescent lights had been Reid's constant companion for years, a dull thrum against the backdrop of his carefully constructed, utterly predictable life. Each morning, the same lukewarm coffee, the same worn briefcase, the same route through the city's indifferent arteries. He managed logistics, a quiet cog in a vast, indifferent machine, ensuring packages moved from one place to another with efficient, uncelebrated precision. His days bled into one another, distinguished only by the subtle shift in the city's exhaust fumes. He'd never considered himself unhappy, merely contained. Then the call came, a crisp, unfamiliar number flashing on his screen amidst a sea of known contacts. A solicitor's precise, unhurried voice explained, with a detached formality, that a distant relative, a great-aunt named Elara, had passed away under unusual circumstances. Reid barely remembered Elara, a fleeting image of a woman with sharp eyes and an unsettling stillness, glimpsed once at a family gathering decades ago. He felt no grief, only a flicker of surprise, a tiny crack in the smooth plaster of his routine. The solicitor went on to explain that Reid was the sole beneficiary of his estate. Not money, not investments, but property. An old cabin. Deep in a forest so remote, the solicitor admitted, there were barely any proper maps. It's secluded, the voice had stated, a slight hesitation, a barely perceptible dip in tone that suggested a more complex truth. And rather ancient. Some local folklore about its origins, nothing substantial, of course. Reid pressed, a nascent curiosity stirring. Folklore? The solicitor cleared his throat. Only that it stands on what was once a particularly old parcel of ground. Burial ground, some say. Utter nonsense, naturally. But the word nonsense felt hollow, an attempt to smooth over an underlying unease. A cabin. An ancient burial ground. It sounded like a story, not a life. And yet, the sheer unexpectedness of it snagged something in Reid. His life, so meticulously ordered, suddenly felt flimsy, a thin veneer over something unknown. He agreed to visit. He wanted to see it, to understand this unexpected tether to a past he didn't know he had. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a summons. The journey was a slow unraveling of the familiar. The city's concrete veins gave way to suburban sprawl, then to rolling farmland, and finally, to a dense, unbroken expanse of forest. The paved roads thinned, then crumbled, becoming gravel tracks that wound deeper and deeper into the wilderness. Reid had hired a driver, a stoic man with calloused hands and a perpetually neutral expression, whose silence only amplified the growing isolation. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp, earthy scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. Sunlight, once bright and insistent, became fractured, filtering through a thick canopy like weak, stained glass light. Hours blurred. He noticed the driver consult a faded, creased map more often than his GPS, muttering about old logging trails. They passed a small, dilapidated structure, almost swallowed by the encroaching overgrowth. It was a weather station, its anemometer long seized by rust, its instruments opaque with grime. A stark monument to abandonment, it only underscored how far they had ventured from anything resembling human industry. The air itself felt different here, thicker, laced with an ancient, mineral tang. He pressed his face against the window, trying to pierce the gloom of the forest, feeling an almost primal shift in his own perception. The trees seemed to grow denser, their branches interlocking like gnarled fingers, blocking out the sky. Almost there, the driver finally rumbled, his voice startling in the sudden quiet. He pointed a thick finger towards a barely visible track veering off the main trail, swallowed almost immediately by ferns and moss. "That's it. As far as the vehicle goes." Reid nodded, his throat suddenly dry. Reid watched the vehicle disappear, the sound of its engine fading quickly until only the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the wind through the pines remained. He was utterly, completely alone. The track was overgrown, branches clawing at his sleeves as he pushed through. The ground was soft with centuries of fallen leaves, absorbing the sound of his footsteps. Then, through a final tangle of ancient rhododendrons, he saw it. The cabin wasn't just old, it was a relic, a hulking silhouette against the deepening twilight. No birds sang nearby, no insects buzzed. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath around it. Reid stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart a dull, insistent drum against his ribs. He felt a profound sense of isolation, but it was more than just being alone. It was the feeling of being watched, of having stepped into a place that had been waiting for him, a place that held its own ancient, simmering secrets. The solicitor's dismissive words about folklore echoed in his mind, no longer sounding like nonsense at all. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was a presence. He had arrived. And the true journey, he realized, was only just beginning. The wind. Reid stood on the porch, the silence of the forest pressing in around him like a heavy, sodden blanket. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, offered no comfort. He was utterly alone. The cabin, a hulking silhouette against the deepening twilight, loomed with an ancient, watchful presence. Its windows, dark and vacant, seemed to stare back, reflecting nothing. He pushed the heavy oak door open wider, stepping into the musty embrace of the interior. A single pull-cord light bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling cast a weak, yellow glow over the main room, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stale air. Furniture, draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts, stood sentinel in various corners. He set his bag down with a thud that echoed unnaturally in the quiet. His first task was to air the place out, to chase away the decades of stillness. He moved from room to room, pulling back curtains, unlatching stiff windows, letting the cool forest air seep in. Each window frame groaned in protest, each latch shrieked like a trapped bird. As he worked, a new sound emerged, subtle at first, a rhythmic thump. Thump. Thump from somewhere upstairs. He paused, listening intently. Nothing to worry about. He went upstairs, found a loose floorboard near what looked like a small, unused attic access, and pressed on it. The thumping stopped. Problem solved. Reid returned downstairs, a determined set to his jaw. He was not one to be spooked by an old house. He spent the next hour simply getting his bearings, exploring the layout. The kitchen was surprisingly intact, if utterly primitive. The living room boasted a massive stone fireplace. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, all similarly draped in sheets. In the smallest bedroom, tucked away at the back, he noticed something. A heavy, carved wooden chair, positioned at a desk covered in a thick layer of dust. He was sure he'd seen it pushed snugly under the desk earlier, but now it sat a few inches out, as if someone had just risen from it. He frowned, running a hand through his hair. He must have nudged it when he'd opened the window, or perhaps the floor was uneven. He pushed it back under the desk with a grunt. Later, as twilight deepened into true night, Reid began to unpack his meager belongings in the main bedroom. He pulled out a stack of books, placing them on a small, dusty nightstand. One book, a thick, leather-bound volume, slipped from his grasp and landed with a soft thud on the wooden floor. He bent to retrieve it, noting its title, The Hidden Roots. He'd picked it up from a small, local shop on his way through the nearest town, intrigued by its local folklore focus. He set it face down on the nightstand, intending to read it later. He went to the kitchen to boil water for instant coffee. The ancient pipes groaned as he turned the tap, and for a moment, the water sputtered out in a rusty trickle before clearing. He blamed the wind, a trick of the old house's drafts. When he returned to the bedroom, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, he stopped dead. The Hidden Roots lay open on the nightstand, its pages splayed. Not just open, but open to a specific page, highlighted by the dim glow. He hadn't touched it since dropping it. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the rough paper. The page detailed ancient beliefs of the local indigenous tribes, speaking of spirits bound to the land, of forgotten pacts made with the earth itself. His breath hitched. He distinctly remembered placing it face down. There was no wind in the room, no tremor to explain it. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He was tired, that was it. Long drive, new place, the stress of the inheritance. He closed the book, this time wedging it firmly under a heavier novel. He needed a distraction. He decided to explore the small study he'd found earlier, a room off the main living area that was less cluttered than the others. He'd noticed a sturdy wooden chest tucked under a built-in bookshelf. He dragged it out, dust motes exploding in the air. The lock was rusted shut, but the wood was surprisingly solid. He found a crowbar in the utility closet and, with a few grunts, managed to pry the lid open. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens and brittle photographs, was a collection of personal effects. A tarnished silver locket, a dried flower pressed between the pages of an antique hymn book, and beneath it all, a small, leather-bound journal. It was smaller than The Hidden Roots, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, its pages brittle with age. He recognized the script inside from a few old letters he'd seen, his distant relatives' neat, spidery handwriting. He opened the journal to a random page. The ink was faded, but legible. August 14th. They speak of the old ways, of the ground beneath this house. They say the surveyor, the one who marked the land for the weather station far to the east, laughed at the old man's warnings. Laughed at the burial cairns. But the laughter will not save him. The pact demands its due. Reid froze, his eyes scanning the words again, then again. The rustle of leaves outside suddenly sounded like 1,000 tiny claws scraping against the walls. The thump. Thump. Thump started again upstairs, louder this time, undeniable. And this time, he knew it wasn't the wind. The thump. Thursday died, swallowed by an abrupt, absolute silence that felt heavier than the preceding sound. Reid stood frozen, the ancient words on the parchment blurring, his breath snagging in his throat. The chilling presence, though no longer actively rising, lingered, a static charge in the air that prickled his skin. He backed away slowly from the desk, his gaze darting around the small, cluttered room. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, trying to rationalize the sudden quiet, the sudden drop in temperature. A draft, perhaps. An old house settling. His mind was playing tricks, surely. He spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood, which clung to his clothes and hair. Sleep was impossible. He paced, clutching the tattered journal, rereading the final, unsettling entry. The ink faded, the language archaic, but the message clear: the debt is due. The ground calls. By dawn, Reid's rationalizations had frayed to nothing. He looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror in the hallway. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He gasped, stepping back, his hand flying to the cold glass. It wasn't just a draft, or an old house. This was something else entirely. He couldn't stay in the cabin without understanding. A frantic energy seized him. He needed answers, something concrete to anchor him. He drove the rough track back towards the nearest small town, a place he'd only glimpsed on the way in. The town itself was little more than a cluster of weathered buildings, a single general store, and a dusty diner. He stopped at the general store first, asking the proprietor, a lean, stoic man, about local history. The man just grunted, nodding towards a dilapidated building on the edge of town. Old Man Hemlock used to keep all sorts of things in the weather station. Records, maps, local gossip. Might find something there. The weather station was a low, squat building, its paint peeling, its windows grimy with years of neglect. A rusted wind vane on the roof tilted precariously. The door creaked open to reveal a single, cramped room filled with an astonishing array of forgotten objects, rusted meteorological instruments, stacks of yellowed almanacs, and, most importantly, several tall, overflowing bookshelves. The air was thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and decaying paper. He pulled down heavy, bound volumes, their covers flaking under his touch. He found old town ledgers, brittle newspapers dating back a century, and even a hand-drawn map of the surrounding forest, detailing property lines that had long since been swallowed by wilderness. Hours passed. His fingers grew grimy, his throat scratchy. He found mention of his distant relative, not by name, but by a description of the family line, referred to obliquely in a local column from the 1930s as the reclusive ones, keepers of the old pact. The word pact made the hair on his arms stand on end. He searched specifically for anything related to the land the cabin stood on. Another spoke of peculiar rites performed by early settlers to appease the ground, mentioning a specific, recurring date. The very date his distant relative had died. Reid's breath hitched. He found a crude, faded drawing tucked into the back of an old land survey, depicting a swirling, almost organic symbol carved into what looked like a standing stone. The casual disappearances, the appeasement rites, the hungry earth, it all coalesced into a terrifying mosaic. The cabin wasn't just built on an ancient burial ground, it was intertwined with something far more sinister, something that demanded a price. The cabin was not just a place of inheritance, it was a trap. And he was already inside. He stood in the center of the main room, the silence pressing in, heavier than any physical weight. They were manifestations of a presence, a watchful, hungry entity. And if the earth demanded a price, then someone, long ago, must have agreed to pay it. His ancestors. The thought was a leaden weight in his chest. Not for an escape, not yet, but for answers. He moved with a newfound urgency, his gaze sweeping over every crevice, every uneven floorboard, every stained patch of wallpaper. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy panes, swirling like tiny, frantic spirits. He ran his hand along the rough-hewn shelves in the small study, feeling for any give, any hidden latch. The books here were ancient, their leather bindings cracked and brittle, their pages foxed with age. Most were theological texts, their titles in Latin, but a few were bound in plain, unmarked canvas. It was empty. A decoy, perhaps? Nothing. He pressed harder, a specific point just above the knot. There was a soft click, barely audible above the rhythmic creak of the old house. It was tied with a length of coarse, braided twine, the knot intricate and ancient. The twine felt rough, almost like dried sinew. He pulled it out, the weight heavier than expected. As he untied the knot, the twine unraveling with a soft rasp, a fine dust drifted from the binding. He opened the book, its stiff pages resisting at first, then yielding with a sigh. The script was an archaic hand, dense and spidery, written in faded black ink. It was a journal, its entries dated centuries ago. The initial entries were mundane, detailing harvests and weather patterns, the births and deaths of family members. But then, the tone shifted. They spoke of lean years, of blight and sickness, of the land refusing to yield. The ancient pact, long dormant, must be honored. They promised a tithe. A lineage-bound obligation, renewed with each generation, lest the earth reclaim us all. Reid swallowed hard, the words a bitter draught. A pact. The pieces of the terrifying mosaic clicked into place. The journal detailed the rituals, the appeasement rites he'd vaguely heard about, but in stark, horrifying detail. Not offerings of grain or coin, but something far more precious. Life. The entity, bound to this soil, accepts only a living sacrifice, a renewal of the bond. It feeds not on flesh, but on the essence, the fear, the life force itself, drawn from the chosen. The ritual must be performed when the air is thinnest, when the moon is full and the ancient stones weep with dew. Our ancestor, the first keeper, recorded the precise atmospheric conditions, the subtle shifts and pressure that precede the entity's awakening. He observed from the highest point, where the winds speak loudest, where the air stills before the storm, and where the ancient stones listen. Reid paused, his mind reeling. He knew that place. It was the rise overlooking the valley, the same spot where, decades ago, the old weather station had been built, its skeletal antennas still pointing skyward, a silent sentinel. The same location the local elder had hinted at, a place of power. The revelation was a physical blow. The journal continued, its later entries growing increasingly frantic, detailing the struggles of successive generations to maintain the pact, the terrible choices they were forced to make. The sacrifices were not always willing. The entity, it seemed, was growing stronger, its demands more frequent, more insistent. The cabin groaned, a long, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up into his very bones. He wasn't just reading a journal, he was waking something. The entity, tied to the land, knew its story was being told. It was no longer a distant threat, it was a present, malevolent force, and it was watching him. He was not just an inheritor of the cabin, but of the pact itself. Reid stood by the cabin's rattling window, the words of the old text swirling in his mind. He knew it, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, even from a distance. A sense of grim purpose settled over him, pushing aside the creeping dread that had been his constant companion. He would go. He had to. The answer, or at least the next piece, waited there. He gathered his worn backpack, stuffing in a water bottle, a small flashlight, and a compass he hadn't used in years. The air in the cabin felt colder, pressing in, as if the very walls disapproved of his intention to leave its confines. A low, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the floorboards, a vibration that felt less like an old house settling and more like a vast, unseen engine idling beneath his feet. He ignored it, or tried to, his resolve hardening with each conscious effort. The hike to the weather station was longer than he remembered, the forest path overgrown and choked with brambles. The trees here were different, ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting like arthritic fingers. The canopy was thick, swallowing the already muted daylight, plunging the trail into a perpetual twilight. He tried to rationalize it as the smell of stagnant water and humus, but the thought brought no comfort. He pushed through a final thicket of thorny bushes, emerging onto a small, windswept clearing. There it stood, the weather station. A rusting tower of girders and cables, its antenna a broken finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. The small, prefabricated hut at its base was a crumbling ruin, its corrugated metal walls scarred by decades of exposure. Reid approached cautiously, the ground uneven under his boots, littered with shards of rusted metal and broken glass. His skin prickled. The hut door, long since ripped from its hinges, hung askew, groaning in the breeze. Inside, it was a wreck, overturned equipment, a desk reduced to splinters, and a thick layer of dust and debris coating everything. Half buried under a pile of collapsed shelving, a small, heavy metal box. It was black with rust, its latch corroded shut. His fingers found purchase, and with a grunt, he tugged it free. It was surprisingly heavy. He worked at the latch, scraping away the rust with a loose piece of rebar he found nearby, until it gave way with a protesting screech. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry, crumbling fabric, lay a single, yellowed parchment. Its edges were brittle, threatening to disintegrate at his touch. Carefully, he unfolded it. The script was faded, elegant, and undeniably old. It was a list of names, each followed by a date. At the top, a strange, looping symbol, vaguely reminiscent of a stylized tree root, or perhaps a grasping hand. And at the bottom, the name of his distant relative, the one who had owned the cabin, followed by the date of his sudden, mysterious death. Reid's breath hitched. This was it. The lineage. The pact. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this was no mere family tree. This was a ledger. A ledger of sacrifice. As he stared at the parchment, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the hut, rattling the remaining metal sheets with the force of a thunderclap. The antenna above groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the very ground. A shower of rust and debris rained down from the ceiling. He stumbled, catching himself on a rusted support beam. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic, sweet smell, now cloying and intense. He fumbled for his phone, needing to document this, needing to tell someone, anyone. No signal. He tried again, moving closer to the open doorway, desperate for a bar. Nothing. Then, the screen flickered, displaying a garbled message he couldn't quite decipher, a jumble of static and distorted symbols. He heard a sound then, not the wind, but a low, guttural murmur that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the weather station, a voice made of grinding metal and ancient wood, speaking words he almost understood, words about claiming in time. The phone screen went black, dead. He clutched the box and the parchment, scrambling out of the hut. The clearing outside felt different now. He looked for the path he'd taken, but it seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the encroaching undergrowth. He walked, then jogged, then ran, crashing through the brush, his heart hammering against his ribs. The forest was no longer just a backdrop, it was an active participant, its branches snagging at his clothes, its roots tripping his feet. The metallic, sweet scent was everywhere now, clinging to his clothes, filling his mouth. He was lost. Truly lost. When he finally stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath, his legs burning, he didn't recognize his surroundings. But then, through a gap in the trees, he saw it, the cabin. He had made it back, somehow. But the relief was short-lived. He approached cautiously, his senses screaming. He pushed the door further open, peering into the gloom. He stepped inside. The hum, that low, resonant vibration, was no longer subtle, it thrummed through the entire structure, a deep, bone-shaking frequency. The temperature inside was glacial, raising gooseflesh on his arms. He reached for the light switch, flipping it. The power was out. Or something had cut it. A sound then, a soft, deliberate scraping from the living room. He edged forward, his hand gripping the heavy metal box like a weapon. The old rocking chair, the one he always found by the hearth, had been moved. It was now directly in the center of the room, facing the doorway, rocking gently, rhythmically, as if someone had just risen from it. And on its seat, where no one should have been, lay a single, desiccated bird's feather, black as midnight. The cabin was a trap. He was in it. And he was no longer alone. Reid's resolve, sparked by the ancient text and the skeletal silhouette of the weather station, burned with a frantic intensity. This cabin, this forest, it was a cage, and the weather station represented a potential key, a vantage point from which to finally grasp the true nature of his imprisonment. He grabbed the thickest jacket he owned, his fingers fumbling with the zipper. The cabin around him felt colder, the air thick with a cloying stillness that pressed against his eardrums. Every creak of the old timbers seemed to whisper his name, a sibilant warning. He pushed open the heavy front door. The forest outside was not the familiar, if eerie, expanse he had grown accustomed to. It was a solid, impenetrable wall of black bark and gnarled branches, each tree a skeletal finger pointing inward. The path, usually a faint rut in the undergrowth, seemed to have vanished, swallowed by a sudden, unnatural proliferation of thorny bushes and grasping vines. "No," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the wind. There had been a lightning-scarred oak, a cluster of moss-covered stones. He pushed forward, forcing his way through the dense thicket, the branches snagging at his clothes, raking against his skin. A sharp sting on his cheek, a warm trickle of blood, yet he barely registered it. His focus was on the weather station, that distant, solitary sentinel. He walked, or so he thought, in a straight line, keeping his eyes fixed on the general direction where he knew the station stood. But the forest began to play tricks. The ground beneath his feet shifted, roots rising like tripwires, mud slicking his boots. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches weaving a canopy so thick that the bruised sky was reduced to slivers of sickly gray. Sounds became distorted. He glanced back, expecting to see some recognizable landmark, the way he had come. But there was nothing but an endless, uniform expanse of forest. The cabin, his only anchor, was gone. He spun around, trying to reorient himself, but every direction looked the same. Through a gap in the skeletal branches, a glint of metal. The weather station. He pushed onward, a desperate surge of hope propelling him. The undergrowth seemed to thin marginally, offering a clearer, if still arduous, path. He pushed through another veil of thorny branches, and then he was there. The weather station stood on a small, exposed clearing. It wasn't a skeletal silhouette anymore. Up close, it was a hulking, rusted edifice of twisted metal and shattered glass, an abandoned testament to human endeavor. But it wasn't just old, it was wrong. The anemometer, meant to spin freely, was fused into a grotesque, static sculpture, its cups warped into claw-like shapes. The wind vane pointed south, but the wind, a low, keening moan, was coming from the east, carrying the faint, sweet sickly odor of something rotten. On the main support beam, where rust had eaten deep into the metal, he saw faint, almost imperceptible etchings. Not graffiti, but symbols. The same symbols he had seen in the old text, the ones describing the pact. This wasn't just a weather station, it was an extension, a nodal point. The highest point, where the winds speak loudest. The winds weren't just speaking, they were carrying the entity's presence, its insidious influence, spreading it across the forest, making this entire domain its own. The cabin was merely the heart of it. His breath hitched. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin walls. It was here, permeating every inch of this desolate clearing, twisting the very structure of the station into something malevolent. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There was no escape through the forest. The forest was the entity. A low, guttural growl echoed from the dense trees at the edge of the clearing. He looked around wildly. Nothing. Yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the distinct sound of heavy, dragging footsteps in the undergrowth, just out of sight. He stumbled backward, turning to run, but the path he thought he'd taken to the station was gone again, replaced by a wall of impenetrable thorns. He spun, disoriented, his mind reeling. The forest pressed in, a living, breathing entity, its branches swaying with a rhythm that wasn't the wind's. He was trapped. There was no way out. His frantic escape had merely confirmed the true extent of his cage. The forest was closing in, and his sanity, already frayed, threatened to unravel completely. He could feel it, a fragile thread snapping, leaving him adrift in a nightmare that had no beginning and no end. He began to run, blindly, desperately, back into the suffocating depths of the woods, not knowing if he was running towards the cabin or deeper into the entity's embrace. Reid plunged deeper into the forest's oppressive embrace, the skeletal silhouette of the weather station his only beacon. The path, if it could be called that, was a tangled gauntlet of grasping branches and slick, moss-covered stones. He pushed on, breath rasping in his throat, the determination of frantic fire in his chest. He had to understand. Finally, the trees thinned, giving way to a small, desolate clearing. Perched atop a low, rocky knoll, the weather station stood stark against the bruised sky. It was a skeletal monument of rusted metal and splintered wood, its anemometer a broken, twisted birdcage spinning lazily in the wind. The structure seemed less built than grown, an organic extension of the ancient earth beneath it. A low, keening moan, like the lament of a forgotten creature, emanated from its decaying framework as the wind tore through its gaps. Reid approached cautiously, his boots crunching on loose gravel. This was it. The key. He pushed the door open further. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust, decay, and something else, a faint, sickly sweetness that made his stomach churn. The single room was small, dominated by a central console, its instruments shattered, wires dangling like severed nerves. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. His gaze swept the room, searching. Nothing immediately obvious. Just dereliction. Then he saw it. Tucked beneath a collapsed shelf, almost completely obscured by debris, was a heavy, leather-bound volume. Its cover was cracked and peeling, but the faint glimmer of tarnished brass clasps caught his eye. He knelt, fingers trembling as he pulled it free. It was not a logbook for meteorological data. This was a chronicle. He brushed away the dust, revealing faded, intricate carvings on the cover, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe, and a recurring symbol he now recognized from the cabin's hidden carvings, a stylized, inverted triangle with 3 points radiating outwards. He opened the book. The pages were thick, brittle parchment, covered in a meticulous, looping script. It wasn't a language he knew, but interspersed throughout were crude, unsettling illustrations. Figures bowed before an unseen presence, offering up crimson bowls. Generations of desperate hands. His eyes scanned the text, his mind struggling to process the horrifying revelation. It detailed the pact, not as a metaphor, but as a binding, blood-soaked contract. The Great Hunger, the text called it, a primal, ancient consciousness rooted in the very soil beneath the cabin, awakened millennia ago by a transgression, then bound by an ancestor's desperate plea for prosperity. It demanded sustenance, a periodic offering to keep its slumber undisturbed, its latent power from consuming everything. The sacrifice. It wasn't symbolic. It was literal. He flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. A family tree, crudely drawn, marked with dates beside each name. Last offering. A faint, low hum resonated through the floorboards, vibrating up through his knees. He could almost feel eyes on him, ancient and hungry. The entity wasn't just a lingering spirit, it was a deep, consuming hunger, a consciousness that had been fed, generation after generation, by his own bloodline. The text continued, describing the consequences of refusing the pact. Should the offering cease, the hunger awakens fully. It will take not one, but all. It will twist the living earth, consume the spirit, and leave naught but husk in memory. It wasn't about appeasing it, it was about delaying its full wrath. The only way to break the cycle, the final, desperate entry stated, was a total cessation. To starve it, yes, but at the cost of facing its unleashed fury, a fury that would claim everything connected to the land, including the bloodline that had bound it. Or, the alternative, a final, ultimate offering to satisfy it completely, to end the pact forever. A sacrifice so profound, so absolute, that it would either grant eternal peace or eternal damnation. The chronicle offered no clear path to victory, only a horrifying choice, to continue the gruesome lineage, or to become the final, catastrophic meal. Reid's hands trembled, the heavy book almost slipping from his grasp. It wasn't just haunting him, it was claiming him. He was the next designated offering. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a larder, and he, the newest provision. The forest, the land, it wasn't just ancient, it was alive, and it was hungry. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the console beside him. A web of fissures spread across the aged metal, as if something from within was trying to break free. The sickly sweet smell intensified, cloying and suffocating. The truth, in all its horrific clarity, settled over him like a shroud of ice. The lineage of sacrifice, the pact, the insatiable entity, it all culminated here, with him. The cold, unseen presence tightened its grip, a suffocating shroud that pressed down on Reid's chest. The low hum, vibrating through the cabin's floorboards, intensified, resonating deep within his bones until his teeth chattered. He felt those ancient, hungry eyes not just on him, but inside him, probing, testing. The entity wasn't just a lingering spirit, it was a deep-rooted horror, an intelligence that had festered for generations. He knew, with a certainty that iced his blood, that it was not merely waiting, it was claiming. Fear, sharp and bitter, clawed at his throat, but beneath it, a desperate resolve hardened his jaw. He wouldn't run. He couldn't. Everything he had learned, every whispered secret, every cryptic drawing from the old journal hidden in the cabin's foundation, pointed to this moment. The true heart of the pact, the place where the lineage's terrible bargain was renewed, wasn't in the cabin itself, but in a structure nearby, a peculiar, isolated building mentioned only in hushed tones, the weather station. He moved, his movements stiff, almost mechanical, as if the air itself had turned to viscous resin. Each step across the groaning floorboards was a battle against unseen resistance. He snatched the thick, leather-bound journal from the rough-hewn table, its pages brittle with age, and clutched the heavy, tarnished silver amulet he'd found wrapped in a swatch of ancient cloth, a relic, the journal implied, of the pact's first making. This was it. The time was upon him. The air thrummed with anticipation, a predatory purr that promised either oblivion or a sliver of hope. Outside, the forest was a black maw, the ancient trees reaching skeletal fingers towards a sky choked with heavy, bruised clouds. The path to the weather station was barely visible, a faint trail obscured by fallen leaves and encroaching undergrowth. Reid stumbled, his flashlight beam a meager defiance against the encroaching gloom. The hum from the cabin seemed to follow him, a low, persistent thrumming that grew louder, more insistent, as he pressed deeper into the woods. Its silhouette was stark against the turbulent sky, a single, tall antenna reaching skyward, its metal groaning faintly in the wind. This wasn't a place for tracking storms, it was a cage, a conduit, or perhaps, a tomb. He pushed against the heavy wooden door, splintered and warped, and it groaned open with a sound like a dying gasp. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something indescribably ancient, a smell that prickled the back of his throat. He swept the beam around the single, circular room. This was the locus event. As Reid stepped fully into the room, the door slammed shut behind him with a thunderous boom that echoed through the stone. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and broken, speaking in a language he couldn't comprehend, yet its meaning was sickeningly clear: claim, consume. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing in on him, stealing his breath. It was a force of pure, distilled malevolence, a consciousness that had existed for epochs, feeding on the fear and the sacrifices of his bloodline. Reid's hands trembled as he opened the journal, flipping to the marked page. His eyes scanned the archaic script, his mind racing to translate the cryptic instructions. At the apex of the cycle, when the veil thins, the blood of the lineage must confront the binding. It wasn't just a seal, it was a key, a conduit. And the true name. It wasn't a word for the entity, but for the pact itself. His ancestors hadn't appeased his spirit, they had enslaved it, or rather, they had become its unwitting shepherds, leading generations of their own to the slaughter. The weather station wasn't a monitoring post, it was a lure, a beacon for the entity, powered by the very weather of despair and sacrifice that had plagued his family. He stared at the altar, the dried stains taking on a new, horrifying significance. He placed the silver amulet firmly in the center of the altar, its cold metal a stark contrast to the rough stone. Reid took a deep, shuddering breath, the acrid air burning his lungs. I sever the thread. I break the pact that feeds this ancient hunger. As the final word left his lips, a deafening shriek tore through the weather station, a sound that wasn't of this world, a raw, primal scream of rage and agony. The walls groaned, the very stone vibrating violently. Cracks spider-webbed across the ceiling. The effigies on the shelves exploded, showering the room with splinters of wood. The hum became a roar, a physical force that slammed into Reid, throwing him against the stone wall. He tasted blood, metallic and hot, filling his mouth. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming, the world tilting precariously. He was outmatched, utterly alone, and the full, horrifying power of generations of sacrifice was about to be unleashed. The shriek had torn through the weather station, a sound that flayed the air itself, leaving a raw, vibrating void in its wake. Reid lay sprawled on the grimy concrete floor, his ears ringing with an unholy echo, every nerve ending screaming in protest. Dust, thick and acrid, hung in the air, catching the weak, flickering glow of the emergency lamp that had somehow survived the cataclysm. His left arm hung limp, a searing pain blossoming from his shoulder. His head pounded, a relentless drumbeat against the inside of his skull, and when he touched his temple, his fingers came away slick. A stray piece of masonry, perhaps, dislodged by the violent tremors. The weather station was a ruin. What hadn't exploded had cracked, sagged, or simply vanished. The shelves that had once held the grotesque effigies were splintered husks, their contents reduced to dust and shards. The very walls seemed to weep fine, gray powder. A gaping fissure snaked across the ceiling, a dark, hungry mouth threatening to swallow the remaining structure whole. The entity was gone, or at least, its furious manifestation had retreated. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. The air felt thin, like he was breathing through gauze. Every breath was a shallow, painful effort. He looked around, searching for a sign, anything that would tell him it was truly over. There was only desolation. He felt stripped bare, not just physically, but internally. The world seemed muted, colors duller, sounds distant. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of staggering steps and blinding pain. When he finally pushed open the cabin door, the hinges groaned in protest, a familiar sound that now seemed alien. The cabin itself was different. The air inside was cool, almost sterile, devoid of the cloying, earthy scent of decay and damp that had permeated it for so long. The very wood of the walls seemed to have exhaled, no longer groaning under an invisible burden. The cabin felt empty. Cleaned out. But not entirely peaceful. There was nothing. Just wood. He walked through the living room, into the kitchen, then the bedroom. The air was still. His face was gaunt, streaked with dirt and blood. His eyes, though, were what truly startled him. He had survived, yes, but he felt like a ghost haunting his own life, a vessel for memories too terrible to fully comprehend. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under his weight. The cabin was free, he was certain of it. The pact, the entity, the lineage of sacrifice, it was all broken. The ancient, malevolent presence had been driven back, perhaps even destroyed. He had paid with his peace of mind, with the very fabric of his sanity, perhaps even with his capacity for simple joy. The world outside, the world he had once known, felt impossibly distant, a fragile dream from which he had violently awoken. He looked towards the window, where the first faint hint of dawn was bleeding into the sky, painting the edges of the ancient forest in hues of bruised violet and gray. It had merely retreated, leaving its indelible mark not just on the land, but on him. The cabin was changed, cleansed, but Reid knew he never would be. Dust, thick and acrid, hung in the air, catching the anemic glow of a single flickering fluorescent tube high above. The metallic tang of ozone, sharp and bitter, clung to his tongue. He tasted copper, a phantom taste of something ripped open, something vital. His vision swam, the concrete blurring into a swirling gray. The air, though still heavy, felt different now, thinner, as if a great weight had been lifted, or perhaps, simply shifted. He scanned the cramped space. The console, a tangle of antiquated wires and dusty dials, was scarred with a fresh, jagged crack across its face, the glass weeping fine shards onto the desk below. Then, the understanding came. Not a sudden flash, but a slow, creeping tide of horrific clarity, seeping into the marrow of his bones. The shriek hadn't been an attack, it had been a retreat, a violent contraction. The pact wasn't about power or dominion, it was about containment. His ancestors hadn't sought to control the entity, but to imprison it. The cabin, the forest, the land itself, they were not merely haunted, but bound. And the entity, a vast, formless hunger that predated memory, had been straining against those bonds for generations. The weather station, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just a point of observation. It was a pressure valve, a weak point, a place where the veil thinned and the entity could be temporarily appeased, or perhaps, through some forgotten mechanism, rebound star. The sacrifices weren't offerings for power, but fuel for the chains, a terrible, bloody renewal of the ancient accord. He saw it now, the full, crushing weight of his lineage, not a line of inheritors, but a line of unwitting jailers, perpetuating a horror they barely understood, each generation passing the terrible burden of keeping the world safe from something that should never have been disturbed. He staggered to the console, his fingers tracing the jagged crack. The green light pulsed, fading, then brightening, a slow, rhythmic beat like a dying heart. He saw faint, almost invisible symbols etched into the metal frame around the screen, symbols that mirrored the crude carvings in the cabin's foundation. They weren't protective wards, he understood now, but anchors, points of connection to the vast, unseen prison beneath the earth. The shriek had been the sound of those anchors being slammed back into place, the entity's desperate scream as it was forced back into its ancient, restless slumber. He had, in his unwitting struggle, become the latest link in that terrible chain. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over him, deeper than any physical fatigue. It was the weariness of carrying an impossible truth. He was free, yes, but at what cost? He looked around the weather station, the air still thick with the residue of something unspeakable. The silence that followed the shriek was not peaceful, it was a heavy, watchful silence, like the breath held by a vast, unseen beast. He pushed open the heavy steel door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped out into the pre-dawn gloom. The birds were silent. He walked, not back to the cabin, but away, down the winding, overgrown path, each step an effort against an unseen current. It looked inert, empty, like a husk. But he knew better. The horror wasn't gone, it was merely dormant, waiting. He had merely bought time, renewed a pact that would one day demand another price. He didn't look back. The long drive out of the forest was a blur of gray trees and winding road. The world outside the forest felt different, too. The sun, when it finally broke through the canopy, seemed muted, its warmth a lie. The sounds of civilization, a distant car, the faint hum of power lines, felt thin and fragile, easily torn. The forest had imprinted itself upon him, not just in memory, but in his very perception. Reid settled into a small, nondescript apartment in a town far from the cabin, far from the forest. He worked a simple job, kept to himself. He tried to reclaim a semblance of his old life, but it was a futile exercise. His reflection in the mirror showed the same face, but the eyes held a new depth, a haunted knowledge that had replaced youthful naivete. He saw the world not as a solid, predictable place, but as a thin veneer over something ancient and terrible, constantly straining to break through. Sometimes, he thought he could feel the faint tremor of something vast and imprisoned, deep beneath the earth, a slow, rhythmic pulse that echoed the fading green light in the weather station. The entity was bound, but not gone. And he, Reid, was irrevocably changed, forever a part of the horror he had unearthed. The world had expanded, revealing a layer of grim reality he could never unsee. The victory, if it could be called that, tasted of ash and the lingering, metallic tang of ozone.